The mid-70s, a time of change. Young people were looking for something new, something different, something loud, fast, and angry. Enter punk rock. Born in the gritty streets of New York City, punk spread like wildfire. It was a rejection of everything mainstream. It was a rebellion against the status quo. This was music for the outcasts, the rebels, the misfits. Punk wasn't just about music, it was a cultural movement. It was about freedom of expression. It was about doing things your own way. It was about challenging authority. Punk said, "We're here, we're loud, and we're not going away." It was more than music, it was an attitude. Punk was a reaction to the times. The Vietnam War had left its mark. The economy was in shambles. The political landscape was a mess. Young people were disillusioned and angry. They needed an outlet. They found it in punk rock. Punk was about energy, passion, and raw emotion. It was about saying what you felt, no matter how raw or unpolished. It was a voice for the voiceless, and it resonated with a generation hungry for something real. To understand punk, you gotta understand the world it came from. The late 60s and early 70s were a time of upheaval. The Vietnam War raged on, leaving scars on America's soul. The Watergate scandal shook people's faith in government. The economy was in the toilet. People were fed up. Musically, things were getting bloated. Prog rock bands were playing 20-minute epics. Stadium rock had become a corporate machine. Disco was all about escapism. Young people were craving something raw, something real, something with an edge. Then there was the art world. Andy Warhol and the factory scene celebrated the outsider. The Velvet Underground, with their raw sound and dark lyrics, provided a blueprint. They proved that music didn't have to be pretty to be powerful. In this climate of disillusionment and rebellion, punk rock was born. It was a reaction against the excess and artificiality of the time. It was a return to basics. It was a breath of fresh air. Punk rock wasn't about musical virtuosity. It was about raw energy and attitude. It was music that anyone could play. All you needed was 3 chords, a simple beat, and something to say. Forget guitar solos and fancy production. Punk songs were short, fast, and loud. The vocals were often shouted or screamed, conveying the urgency and anger of the lyrics. The music was raw, unpolished, and full of energy. Punk lyrics were direct and confrontational. They tackled social issues, political corruption, and personal alienation. They challenged authority and questioned everything. Punk wasn't afraid to be offensive, controversial, or just plain loud. Punk's sound was a direct reflection of its DIY ethos. It was music made by the people, for the people. It was a rejection of the polished, corporate sound of mainstream music. It was music that came from the streets. Punk was more than just music. It was a way of life, a philosophy. The heart of punk was the DIY ethic, do it yourself. If you wanted something done, you did it yourself. You didn't wait for some record label to discover you. You didn't need permission to make your voice heard. Punk bands booked their own shows, made their own posters, and released their own records. They created their own fashion, often from safety pins, ripped clothing, and whatever they could find. Punk was about self-reliance, creativity, and sticking it to the man. This DIY ethic extended to every aspect of punk culture. Punk fanzines sprung up, spreading the word about bands and gigs. Punk artists created their own unique visual style, often using stencils, collages, and Xerox machines. Punk was about taking control and making your own scene. The DIY ethic gave punk its raw energy and authenticity. It was a rejection of the corporate music industry and a celebration of independent creativity. It was a message of empowerment for a generation that felt ignored and disenfranchised. From CBGB to the world punk's New York roots. New York City in the mid-1970s was a breeding ground for punk. A dive bar on the Bowery called CBGB became the movement's epicenter. It was a haven for misfits, artists, and musicians. It was the perfect place for punk to take root. Bands like the Ramones, Television, and Blondie cut their teeth at CBGB. They played fast, loud, and raw. They challenged audiences with their energy and attitude. They were the pioneers of a new sound. The Ramones, with their simple, catchy songs and Ramones logo, are considered the godfathers of punk. Their influence on the genre is immeasurable. They were the blueprint, fast, loud, and to the point. CBGB was more than just a club. It was a community. It was a place where anything went. It was a breeding ground for creativity and rebellion. It was the birthplace of punk rock. Punk rock wasn't just an American phenomenon. It quickly spread across the Atlantic to England, where it took on a life of its own. British punk was angrier, more political, and more nihilistic. It reflected the social and economic turmoil of 1970s Britain. The Sex Pistols, with their sneering vocals and confrontational lyrics, became the poster boys for British punk. Their song "God Save the Queen" became an anthem for a generation disillusioned with the monarchy and the establishment. The Clash, with their politically charged lyrics and musical experimentation, brought a new level of sophistication to punk. They proved that punk could be more than just 3 chords and a scream. They could be thoughtful, complex, and musically adventurous. Punk exploded in the UK, inspiring countless bands and a new wave of DIY culture. It spread from the underground to the mainstream, challenging the status quo and changing the face of music forever. It was a cultural bomb that exploded on both sides of the Atlantic. Punk rock produced a wealth of iconic albums that defined the genre and continue to inspire These albums weren't just collections of songs, they were statements. They were calls to arms. They were the soundtrack to a revolution. The Ramones' self-titled debut album, released in considered the quintessential punk album. It's raw, it's fast, and it's full of attitude. It's the blueprint for everything that came after. The Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols, released in became the soundtrack to a generation's rebellion. It was controversial, it was banned, and it was brilliant. The Clash's London Calling, released in 1979, showed the world that punk could be. It was a sprawling, ambitious double album that incorporated elements of reggae, rockabilly, and ska. These albums and countless others captured the raw energy DIY spirit of punk rock. They remain essential listening for anyone who wants to understand the power and the glory of punk. Punk rock wasn't just about the music, it was about the live experience. Punk shows were raw, chaotic, and unpredictable. They were a release valve for the energy and frustration of both the bands and the audience. The stage was a war zone. Bands thrashed around, spitting, sweating, and bleeding. The audience responded in kind, slam dancing and stage diving with reckless abandon. Punk shows were a celebration of freedom, rebellion, and pure, unadulterated energy. Punk performances were a direct assault on the senses. The music was loud, the lights were blinding, and the energy was infectious. It was an immersive experience that left you drained, exhilarated, and wanting more. But punk shows weren't just about chaos. They were about community. They brought together like-minded individuals who felt like outsiders. It was a place where you could be yourself, no matter how strange or different you were. Punk rock may have peaked in the late 1970s, but its influence continues to reverberate through music and culture today. Punk's DIY ethic, its rebellious spirit, and its raw energy continue to inspire generations of artists, musicians, and activists. Punk's influence can be heard in countless genres, from grunge to pop punk to hardcore. Its DIY ethic continues to fuel independent music scenes around the world. Its message of rebellion and nonconformity still resonates with those who feel like outsiders. Punk's legacy extends beyond music. It's about standing up for what you believe in, even if it means going against the grain. It's about challenging authority and questioning the status quo. It's about expressing yourself without fear or censorship. Punk rock may have been a brief, explosive moment in time, but its impact is still felt today. It's a reminder that anyone can make a difference. It's a call to arms for all the freaks, geeks, and misfits out there. Don't just stand there, do something, make some noise. This is your time.